Foundations of Western Political Thought. Module 0, Orientation, Why Study Dead Philosophers. Right, welcome. I want to begin with a story, if I may. In 1683, a physician named John Locke was living in Oxford, keeping his head down. He had been rather too close to the Earl of Shaftesbury. Shaftesbury had just died in exile after a failed plot against the king. The government was watching Locke. His rooms were searched. His correspondence was monitored. One night, Locke fled to Holland with manuscripts stuffed in his baggage. He would spend 5 years there, moving between cities, sometimes using false names, writing the works that would reshape political philosophy, the 2 treatises of government, the essay concerning human understanding, the letter concerning toleration. When he finally returned to England after the Glorious Revolution, he came back on the same ship as the future Queen Mary. Rather a good story, that. Now, why does this matter? Because when you read Locke on the right of revolution, on the limits of government power, on the importance of toleration, these weren't abstract exercises. He was writing with real fear, real stakes, real consequences in mind. The arguments meant something. That's what I want to recover in these lectures. Not philosophy as a museum exhibit, but philosophy as it was, lived, by people who took enormous risks for their ideas, who sometimes got things badly wrong, who were responding to crises as real as any we face today. Why bother with the dead? Right. So why should you spend hours? Rather a lot of hours, I should warn you, listening to lectures about people who died centuries ago. Let me give you 3 reasons, each more practical than it might first appear. The first reason is that their ideas are still running right now. In arguments you hear every day, when a politician invokes natural rights, they're channeling Locke, usually without knowing it, often while mangling what he actually said. When someone argues that we shouldn't tear down institutions just because we can't fully articulate why they work, they're echoing Edmund Burke. When an activist claims that our institutions don't just fail to solve problems but actively create them, that what looks like civilization is really sophisticated oppression, that's Rousseau's ghost, still walking. The vocabulary of modern politics, rights, liberty, consent, the social contract, the general will, the harm principle, this vocabulary was invented. Specific people made it up to solve specific problems. When we use these words without understanding their origins, we're rather like someone swinging a tool without knowing what it was designed for. Sometimes we get lucky, often we don't. The second reason is more pointed. People lie about philosophers. Or rather, and this is important, they quote selectively, strip context, and conscript dead thinkers for causes those thinkers might not recognize. You've heard John Stuart Mill's harm principle invoked in debates about free speech, the idea that the only justification for restricting liberty is to prevent harm to others. It gets quoted as if Mill was some kind of libertarian absolutist. But Mill worried enormously about the tyranny of public opinion. He thought the pressure of social conformity could be as crushing as any law. He spent chapters agonizing over what counts as harm. The slogan version of Mill is a cartoon, frankly. Or take Locke on property. Everyone knows the bit about mixing your labor with nature. You pick the apples become yours. Libertarians love this, but how many of them quote the very next part, where Locke insists you can only take what you can use before it spoils, and you must leave enough and as good for others? The full argument is more interesting, more complicated, and rather more challenging than the bumper sticker. This course will teach you to hear the difference. When someone invokes a philosopher, you'll be able to ask, is that what they actually said? What's being left out? The third reason is perhaps the most important. It explains something you've probably noticed, something frustrating, and I think genuinely mysterious. Have you ever argued with someone intelligent and sincere and found you couldn't make any progress at all? You make what seems like an obvious point. They just don't see it. They make what seems obvious to them. You're unmoved. You're not stupid. They're not stupid. But somehow you're looking at the same world and seeing entirely different things. Those differences didn't come from nowhere. You've inherited different philosophical frameworks, different assumptions about human nature, about what institutions are for, about whether change brings progress or destruction. And the thinkers we'll study are the ones who built those frameworks. Trace the disagreement back far enough, and you'll often find yourself at Rousseau versus Burke, or Hobbes versus Locke, or Plato versus Aristotle. Understanding these debates won't necessarily resolve your disagreements, but it will help you understand why they're so beastly hard to resolve. And occasionally it might reveal some unexpected common ground. The texture of ideas. Right. Let me show you what I mean about making ideas concrete. Thomas Hobbes published Leviathan in 1651, dry date. What does it tell you? Nothing much. But consider this. Hobbes was born in 1588, and he liked to say that his mother gave birth to twins himself and fear. She went into labour prematurely, when news arrived that the Spanish Armada had been sighted off the coast. True or not, Hobbes dined out on this story his whole life. Rather good value at a dinner party, one imagines. And fear really is the key to Hobbes. He lived through the English Civil War, a catastrophe that killed a higher proportion of the British population than the First World War. He saw what happens when political order collapses, when religious certainty becomes religious violence, when everyone is sure they're right and willing to kill for it. He fled to Paris and wrote Leviathan in exile, haunted by the chaos he'd witnessed, desperate to understand what holds societies together and what happens when that glue dissolves. When Hobbes writes that life without government is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, that's not abstract theorizing. That's a man who had seen bodies in the streets, who had friends on both sides of a civil war, who understood in his bones what violence means. Or consider Burke. Edmund Burke is often presented as the voice of comfortable tradition, the defender of inherited privilege, the enemy of change. But Burke's career tells a rather different story. His great causes were the rights of American colonists, the suffering of Irish Catholics under the penal laws, the abuses of the East India Company in Bengal. This was not a man who thought everything was fine and nothing should change. What Burke opposed was not reform but revolution, the idea that clever men could tear down everything that had evolved over centuries and replace it with something designed from scratch, according to rational principles. He had seen the French Revolution up close, corresponded with French friends who supported it, and watched in horror as it devoured its own children. The terror vindicated his warnings with rivers of blood. When you know these stories, the ideas come alive. They stop being positions on a chart and become responses to that which one has experienced, attempts to make sense of chaos, to prevent catastrophe, to build something that might last. The fork in the road. Right. Here's the structure of this course in brief. We'll begin with what I call the shared inheritance. The ideas that formed common ground for educated Westerners. even when they disagreed violently on particulars. The Greeks gave us the vocabulary. Plato, who believed that behind the chaos of appearances lay permanent truths accessible only to the trained mind. Aristotle, his student, who thought Plato had it backwards, that wisdom comes from careful attention to the world as we find it, not escape to some realm of pure forms. Their disagreement set the terms for 25 centuries of argument. Quite an achievement, really. Christianity transformed this inheritance. It added the idea of conscience, that inner voice that might oppose even legitimate authority. It added original sin, the suspicion that human nature is wounded in some deep way that no social arrangement can fully heal. It added the dignity of every soul, slave or free, Greek or barbarian. And it added a long argument about the relationship between faith and reason, church and state, that is still being fought today. Then came the modern turn, Machiavelli, stripping politics of its moral veneer, Hobbes building authority from the ground up, Locke grounding government in consent and natural rights, and then the fork in the road. In the 18th century, thinkers drew radically different conclusions from the Enlightenment's critique of tradition. Rousseau diagnosed civilization itself as the problem, our natural goodness corrupted by social competition, our authenticity buried under masks of propriety. His solution: transformation, a return to something more natural, a politics of the general will. Burke watched Rousseau's followers in France and saw catastrophe unfolding. His response: inherited institutions embody wisdom we can't fully articulate. Destroy them, and you destroy more than you know. Reform carefully, preserve what works, respect the experience of generations. These two responses, transform versus preserve, design versus evolution, the corrupted present versus the wisdom of the past, still shape how we argue today. Understanding where they came from is the first step toward understanding why our debates feel so utterly stuck. The labels that lost their meaning. Consider the contemporary confusion in Australia, and I gather many of you are listening from there. The Liberal Party is not particularly liberal. Not in the classical sense of limited government, free markets and individual liberty. The Labour Party is not particularly socialist. Where are the nationalised industries, the worker control, the collective ownership? What remains is cultural progressivism on one side, managerialism on the other, and a great deal of confusion about what anyone actually stands for. The classical liberal who wants limited government finds no home. The genuine conservative who wants to preserve tested institutions finds no champion. The labels persist, but the content has rather drained away. This is what happens when political vocabulary is inherited without understanding. The words become tribal markers rather than philosophical commitments. People fight over labels while forgetting what the labels once meant. It's all rather a mess, frankly. This course will not tell you which tradition is correct, but it will show you what they actually claimed, where they diverged, and why, so that when you hear the words deployed in contemporary argument, you will know whether they are being used with understanding or merely as noise. What you'll need. Right, a word about philosophical vocabulary. I won't pretend you don't need any. Words like teleology, epistemology, dialectic, these aren't pretentious jargon, whatever you might think. They're precision tools, and sometimes only the right tool will do. But I'll never assume you know them. When a term appears, I'll explain it plainly, with examples, and I'll reinforce it when it comes back. By the third or fourth time you encounter a word, it should feel entirely natural. Here's an example. Teleology, from the Greek telos, meaning end or purpose. A teleological explanation explains something by what it's for, not what caused it. Aristotle was obsessed with teleological questions. What's a knife for? Cutting. What's an eye for? Seeing. What's a human being for? Ah, now it gets interesting. For Aristotle, humans are for flourishing, for living well, for exercising the capacities that make us distinctively human. And once you know what something is for, you know what a good version of it looks like. A good knife cuts well, a good eye sees clearly, a good human lives well in community with others, exercising reason and virtue. Modern science largely abandoned this way of thinking. Physics doesn't ask what gravity is for. That would be an odd question. But in ethics and politics, teleological questions refuse to stay buried. What is marriage for? What is government for? What is a university for? Answer differently, and you'll disagree about everything that follows. You'll meet this word again when we discuss Aristotle properly, and again when later thinkers attacked or modified teleological thinking each time. It'll make more sense, I promise. What lies ahead? Right? In the 15 lectures that follow, we'll work through this story properly. Roughly 10 hours of material tracing Western political thought from Athens to the present day. Rather a journey, but a worthwhile one, I think. We begin with the Greeks who invented the game, Plato's Philosopher Kings and Aristotle's Practical Wisdom, the question of what human beings are for and how we should live together. Then the Christian transformation, Paul, Augustine, Aquinas, and the Reformation. How the idea of conscience emerged, how original sin reshaped views of human nature, how the long argument between faith and reason began. The moderns rebuilt on new foundations. Machiavelli stripped politics of its moral veneer. Hobbes built authority from fear and contract. Locke grounded government in consent and natural rights. We'll pause to consider epistemology, how we know what we claim to know, because disputes about knowledge underlie disputes about politics. Then the fork in the road. Rousseau diagnosed civilization as corruption. Burke saw inherited wisdom worth preserving. Their disagreement still shapes how we argue. The 19th century brought earthquakes. Hegel's dialectic and the march of history, Marx's materialism and the critique of capitalism, Bentham's utility and Mill's liberty, Nietzsche's hammer smashing idols and asking what remains, Carlyle's great man theory and the critique of democracy itself. We'll examine how power actually operates. Not in philosophy, but in institutions. The elite theorists, Mosca, Pareto, and Michels showed that organized minorities rule disorganized majorities, regardless of what constitutions say. Rather uncomfortable reading for Democrats, that. And finally, the 20th century's great argument. Rawls asked how to design just institutions from first principles. Hayek warned that the attempt destroys what it seeks to create. Sowell tested theory against evidence and found that progressive policies often harm those they claim to help, and the conservative inheritors, Oakeshott, Kirk, Vogelin, Scruton, asked what gets lost when politics becomes engineering, what happens when we forget what we've inherited. By the end, you should be able to hear a political argument and recognize its roots. You should understand why intelligent people see the world so differently, and you should have a clearer sense of your own assumptions, where they came from, what they imply, and where you might reasonably be wrong. How this course was built. Right. A word about method, because it matters rather a lot. This course was constructed on a simple principle: present each thinker as they would present themselves, not as their critics caricature them, not as selective quotation distorts them, but as serious intellectuals, making serious arguments about problems that genuinely troubled them. This means you will hear positions defended that you may find uncomfortable: Burke's defense of prejudice, Carlyle's contempt for democracy, Hayek's skepticism about redistribution, Nietzsche's critique of pity. These are not straw men to be knocked down. They are arguments that intelligent people have found compelling for centuries. You may disagree. That's entirely your prerogative, but you should understand them first. It also means you will hear positions criticized that you may consider obviously correct: Rawls's veil of ignorance as problems, Marx's predictions failed rather spectacularly, Rousseau's general will enabled terror, Mill's optimism about rational discourse has not aged well. No thinker gets a free pass. Now, there is a particular trap I have tried to avoid, and I want to be quite explicit about this. Much contemporary education assumes progressive premises as defaults: that change is progress, that tradition is obstacle, that equality of outcome is the measure of justice, that those who resist these assumptions are motivated by ignorance or bad faith. This course rejects that frame entirely. Redistribution is not an obvious good that only the selfish oppose. It is a contested claim with serious arguments on multiple sides. Some see it as justice, others see it as theft by majority vote. You will hear both cases presented as their advocates would present them. Tradition is not mere prejudice waiting to be overcome. It may encode wisdom that cannot be fully articulated. Solutions to problems we have forgotten we solved. Burke made this case. Hayek extended it. Oakeshott refined it. You will hear their arguments as they made them, not as their critics dismissed them. Progress is not inevitable or even reliably directional. The 20th century produced unprecedented horrors alongside unprecedented advances. Voyelin warned that utopian politics produces dystopian results. The evidence rather supports him. I am not telling you what to conclude. That would be impertinent. I am telling you that the conclusion is yours to reach after you have heard the arguments, understood their origins, and weighed their consequences. That is what education means, properly understood. How to listen. Right. Finally, some advice on listening. These lectures are arguments, not information. The thinkers we'll study were not handing down revealed truth. They were wrestling with hard problems, often contradicting each other, sometimes changing their minds. Plato and Aristotle disagreed. Hobbes and Locke disagreed. Rousseau and Burke disagreed so fundamentally they might as well have inhabited different planets. Rawls and Hayek represent incompatible visions of what justice requires. Your job is not to absorb passively, but to argue back. When I present a position, ask yourself, is this true? Does this follow? What would someone who disagreed say? If you're nodding along to everything, you're not really engaging. Philosophy demands your critical attention. It's rather the point of the exercise. Be charitable, though. These thinkers were not stupid. If something sounds obviously wrong, consider the possibility that you haven't yet understood what they meant. Try to see why an intelligent person might have believed it. You can still disagree after you've understood, but understanding must come first. Always. And notice your own reactions. When do you find yourself resisting? When do you feel something click into place? Those reactions are data. They tell you something about your own assumptions, your own philosophical inheritance, which may be more interesting than the thinkers themselves. Right then, let's begin. End of Module 0.